Hey, it's Matt from Stronger You. I show you how to add up to 200 pounds to your total in 4 months in order to get ready for your first powerlifting meet, and how to do it all with 5 hours or less of gym time per week so you can actually have a life too. Now, today's video is something a little bit different from what we've done. Previously, we've worked with a lot more informational guides and how to do it yourself. This is going to be more of a case study of a lifter named Taylor that I've worked with previously. And now, if you're somebody who struggles with plateaus, you'll have a big surge of strength and then everything runs flat, you're definitely going to want to watch this video because I'll walk you through not just the program that we did, which will be available as a free download in the links down below, but also show you why we made the changes that we made so that you can actually customize these templates for your own use and use them as a starting point rather than something that you're following blindly. So without further ado, let's jump in and talk about how I took Taylor from a 495-pound deadlift plateau. He'd been stuck there for about a year when we'd started working together, to 550 in his first 4 months of working with me, all the way up to from May to December of this past year, taking him from a 562 up to his new deadlift PR at 639 pounds. So let's jump in. I'll show you everything we did. We'll walk through the different phases and I'll show you programming wise how we made the changes and why we made the changes as we go. Let's do this. So before we jump in, a little bit of background on who Taylor was as a lifter. Now, he'd been working with a lot of different apps. He'd tried things like Juggernaut AI, things like Evolve or Alpha Progression, I believe. And what he was finding pretty routinely was while the volume did help him feel good very initially, he would burn out incredibly fast. And we'll notice this is a theme in his training as we go through the different phases. There's kind of 5 phases. So briefly, I just want to show you, here's sort of the timelines that we were working with. So we had started working together in May 2022. We'd started working together with my main coaching program, what's now the Platform Ready Blueprint, with the goal of getting him past this funk he was in his training. So we're gonna focus mostly on his deadlift today, but as an extension of that, we'll talk a little bit about some of the implications from his bench and his squat, just to fit things together into a cohesive picture, just because nothing's going to happen in isolation. So from May 2022 to September 2022, he'd started at a 495-pound deadlift. And over the course of those 4 months, we did a couple of things, right? So first and foremost, we just worked on bringing up volume to finding when do you start to regress? What's sort of that upper limit of volume that you can progress towards and maintain at without getting worse? And this is a really important diagnostic tool so that you can quantify knowing how much is too much. And we found that pretty routinely that sort of 10, 11 sets per week of actual deadlifting was about as much as he could recover from before things fell off a cliff. And so all we did is we just kept that as a pretty standard upper ceiling, and periodically we would go past it, but spending most of our time in that 6 to 10 set range. Tapered down to a lower end of things, just as you would for a meet, reducing that volume as you get closer to a test date, and we did that. Now, with that said, there's a couple additional things that we ended up doing that made a bigger difference with his deadlifts outside of the programming. And the first was just cleaning up his wedge. We noticed that when he was getting into the bar, he would tighten up his lats, but he wouldn't really bring his hips into the bar. And as a result, it made it harder for him to create a lot of power through that midpoint of the lift. If he got the bar to about his knees, it's where he was going to be most prone to failing. So we had that. Our next phase took us from basically the start of 2023. He'd taken a couple months off from coaching at this point, trained a little bit more generally, and we started out March of 2023 with the goal of prepping for his first ever powerlifting meet. And so we started here in a very similar fashion to what had worked well for him prior to the break, right? We started with slightly higher volume, started working on tapering things down, building off his new maxes. But what we were starting to find around the spring into sort of April, give or take, of the year, a couple months in, is he was just finding that he was feeling really burnt out and stale on training. And while we didn't really get a chance to progress on this idea too much, it was something I kept in the back of my mind. He had some personal things come up, which meant that we had to put things on break until about the end of August. And when we jumped into that third phase of training, we said, let's adjust things a little bit and start to work on more of an alternating frequency, something we'd been talking about a little bit more before. If you haven't seen that yet, I really like alternating frequencies or alternating programming, especially with the squat and deadlift, as a way to space out the stressors. So if you find that you can do a good squat, you can do a good deadlift, but they bleed into each other a lot and the fatigue from one will detract from your ability to perform and progress on the other, alternating periodization is an awesome way to space that out, where basically on weeks 1 and 3 of a 4-week block, you would do a heavier squat, and on weeks 2 and 4, you would do a heavier deadlift. And this is a great way to train everything together without having to specialize in any one lift. Now, we're starting out basically around that sort of 550 mark on his deadlift at this point, and we're noticing, hey, he's starting to feel kind of burnt out. We've had a bit of a stop-start for the last 6, 8, 10 months, and it's just been a little disruptive. Let's try to get some momentum back. So once he'd had those personal issues set aside, we had from August until about December of that year to prep for his first official meet. And at his first meet, he hit some good PRs. He hit a 5 kilo, very easy deadlift PR at 562. He hit a nice squat PR at a little over 500 pounds. And bench, same thing. Things went pretty well. It was a really solid, productive first meet. And so we jumped into our next prep right off the bat. And what we noticed is, hey, you didn't quite get that same surge in improvement where we added, over 10 pounds a month to your deadlift, like we did when we were doing the PR blueprint, to now. And I don't expect that to be a constant, continuous thing, but the drop off in progress compared to what we got initially seems like there's something missing. And especially with you describing your workload tolerance being lower than usual, feeling more burnt out, knowing that we can't just spam volume and add more and more and more, especially on a lift like the deadlift, we like to take a bit of a different strategy instead. Now, Taylor has historically performed really well with high intensity lifts, but we've got a short time span that we can work on it with. And without getting into the crazy, boring amounts of data, what I've found is that we're generally good for 2 or 3 weeks of high intensity on a lift before he starts to go backwards. Now, to me, this is a trademark signature of somebody who's going to perform well with something more akin to like a conjugate style of training. And this is where we get back to that question of, okay, well, what kind of systems do you use in your coaching? What kind of programs do you use? And the ultimate answer is I use a system of systems. Right? And so we used a more conventional, more specific, you're going to deadlift every week and we'll adjust your sets and your reps and your weights. And that had worked up to this point. But now in order to get past this, we needed to find different ways for him to manage the fatigue so that he could mentally stay fresher and attack those intensities, but also get in training that was really productive for him. And so what we'd said is, hey, let's start to experiment with a conjugate style of programming. It already fits in really easily with this alternating periodization model that we're doing. And we're going to simply focus on a 3-lift rotation. This is something I really love to do with the lifters that I work with in that more conjugate style. And with this, very simply, we create a 3-session wave that we go through. Now, if you're somebody who's training weekly, this could be 3 weeks. If you're training an alternating style, you might have this stretch out over 6 or 8 weeks, or even just 2 blocks like we've done here. And so the way I organized things for Taylor is we basically had, except for this first block, which was a separate thing, we basically said you're either going to have 1 heavy squat and 2 heavy deadlifts in a block, or you're going to have 2 heavy squats and 1 heavy deadlift in the block. And all we did here was worked backwards from the meet, knowing, hey, your next meet is in December of 2024. I need your heaviest deadlift at 3 weeks out. I need your heaviest squat at 2 weeks out. And then we just simply worked our way back. So you can see I want, roughly speaking, that alternating those blocks of squat focus and deadlift focus. And so working back to where we'd started in May, we basically just had this sort of focus of, all right, squats, deadlifts, starting out the wave. I wasn't too worried about having another one, an extra deadlift session in there. But we just figured out, you can see 2 deadlifts, 1 deadlift, 1 deadlift, 2 deadlifts, and so on. And so working backwards from the meet was the first thing we did. And having a long prep like this gives you a little bit more flexibility where you can experiment a bit. Now, from here, there was 3 lifts that I like to incorporate into the wave. I like to have my primary competition lift as the third and most specific session in the wave. The goal is prioritizing that readiness for that session. And then from there, the session before it, I like to have a variant that is going to attack a weak point. I like it for two reasons. So one is middle of the wave, you're not going to be dealing with tremendous amounts of fatigue, but it's not going to be particularly low either, where you can just breeze through anything. And at the same time, it allows you to use a lift that you're inherently going to use less weight with, so that you show up a little fresher to the primary session. And so then again, working backwards, where do we want to have the lifts that expose him to the highest weights? Because Taylor's a very intensity sensitive lifter. So we said, all right, well, let's make your primary deadlift session 3. Let's make your weak point deadlift session 2. And let's make your overload deadlift, so a partial range of motion like a block pull, session 1. And so the way that we ended up working this out is we said, you're going to go really heavy on 1. You're going to go lighter, but still pushing a weak point on 2. And you're going to go a competition style on 3. And then we just worked backwards from there. And over the course of 8 weeks at a time, that's what we ended up with. We deloaded generally every 4th week, roughly speaking, with a couple exceptions there. And his squats mirrored that, where we had 2 heavy squats with the blocks where he had a competition deadlift. And then we had 1 heavy squat with the blocks that he had working more of his variance. Now from here, zooming out again, looking at the entire meet prep, I wanted to have largely singles in the last month as a bare minimum. And then from there, we biased singles a little longer on the deadlift, just because I find that those lifters that benefit from the intensity do well with doing more singles as opposed to a really challenging double more often, or at least closer to the meet. Whereas his squat, we were working still on developing a couple things in terms of depth and technique. And what I wanted to go through here is with his squat, we had a little bit of a different rotation where we still had a squat as his 3rd session, but we would go high bar, box squat, and then a low bar squat. So high bar was sort of a middle of the road, fairly medium stress squat session for him. And especially because high bar typically coincided before a heavier deadlift for the most part. Didn't want to go too crazy with that. We also didn't need to stretch as much. His squat was still progressing. So we had high bar, then we did a box squat, mostly just to reinforce his hips, the bottom of the lift. And then we had his competition squat. And that was our 3 lift rotation that we went through there. It undulates a little, but by and large, working more triples at the start of prep, working singles as we get closer to meet date. Now, this is the fun part. You can see the proof is obviously in the pudding with this stuff, where we're ending up with not very frequent sessions on the deadlift, but it increased lift over lift over lift, and his projected max came up super linearly in spite of the weights on the bar being a little bit more exponential as we got closer to. So a couple other things that are relevant here. It might look a little creepy, or freaky at least, if you've got a training session that's happening every other week. You're like, well, I've been deadlifting twice a week and I'm gonna go to a quarter of that now? Not quite. The way we organized his weeks were a little bit different. And the way that we structured it was he had his primary lower body day on Wednesday. So this is where he'd go for either a big squat or a big deadlift. And because we were really focused on building his deadlift, because it's where we could make the most gains on his total, he would do a secondary deadlift every week. And so we did touch and go deadlifts. They weren't as fatiguing for his erectors. They allowed him to handle some reasonably heavy weights without getting that systemic fatigue that he would get from a bunch of dead stop reps. So we did that as every week. And from there, we would follow it up with a little bit of extra accessory work. So he would have his conventional deadlift that would happen, or his deadlift, block pull, deficit pull, and so on, that would happen on the Wednesdays. On Fridays, he would do some lighter squatting, typically 80 to 90% of the weights that he was doing on his primary squat days, for mostly lower reps, higher amounts of sets. So 7 triples, 8 doubles, things like that. And then we'd follow it up with a little bit of extra quad work. This might be a hack squat or leg press. And if you want a template for any of these, I've got the exact 6-month progression that we did outlined on a spreadsheet that you can download, again, from the link down below. Finally, with his deadlift on the Monday, what we would end up doing would be just some support work, building up more the muscles as opposed to deadlifting. And so these were things like good mornings, back extensions, hip thrusts, basically the goal of building up his glutes and his lower back without fatiguing him in the same way as a conventional or standard deadlift would beat him up. And so that basically became our rotation, where his frequency was actually still reasonably high, but the specific frequency was quite low. And so that's why on paper, when you look at an Excel sheet, it can be like, oh, well, he's deadlifting 3 times every 2 months. But in reality, he's doing deadlift or deadlift related work a little closer to 6 to 8 times a month. And that's where the frequency came in. By building that muscular side of things, making him stronger at his potential to deadlift, and then practicing the specific skill less frequently, we were able to sidestep that burnt out feeling he was doing. And for illustrative purposes here, like this is a guy who's working his full-time job and he's starting up his own business. So he's working 70 to 80 hours a week and he's got 2 kids. So he can't just be, doing whatever in the gym all the time. And that's why we had set things up as a 3-day work week. So again, if you want a full spreadsheet that has the exact numbers and everything we used and how to apply it to your own, including the RPEs, I've loaded it all into a spreadsheet here so that you can see on each of the 6 blocks, what are you going to do on a day 1, a day 2, a day 3 for both his squat and deadlift training. And this should hopefully give you some inspiration, both in terms of just generally what's possible. If you're somebody who's really sensitive to those higher volumes and you tend to feel burnt out and plateau quite quickly, as well as seeing, just how much nearly 150 pounds of deadlift progress can be something that's doable in as little as 2 years if you're focused in on it and you really lock in with the training, even with the ups and downs of everyday life. If you want more information like this, I'd recommend the next video you check out be around a video I call the 4-hour powerlifting week. Shows you how to set up your training week and training sessions to be 4 hours or less of total gym time. And if you're not already, I'd recommend you subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.